Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This week's video is a follow-up to last week, which was about making invert sugar syrup. If you did see that video, you may have noticed I put a few disclaimers when I was discussing the properties of invert syrup as it relates to frozen desserts like ice cream. As some very quick review, invert sugar or invert syrup is when sucrose is broken down into fructose and glucose, and the result is something with significantly higher anti-freezing power compared to regular sugar. But here's what did not make sense to me. With sucrose having the baseline anti-freezing power of 100, pure dextrose slash glucose has a anti-freezing power of 190, but invert syrup, which is supposed to be a 70 to 80% solution of both glucose and fructose, is also supposed to have an anti-freezing power of 190. Multiple online sources list the anti-freezing power of invert syrup or corn syrup as 190, which does not account for the water in the mixture. Maybe all of these sources are just rounding up the values, but it was especially confusing that these numbers were also in, essentially, a professional gelato textbook I was reading called Il Gelato Senza Segreta. My basic recipe and procedure for making invert syrup is based on the one in that professional gelato book, and the numbers they give for 100 grams of the 70% syrup is equivalent to pure glucose. So I essentially made 5 batches of unflavored sorbet. The control recipe was 100 grams of regular sugar or sucrose, 400 grams of water, 1 gram of xanthan gum, and 2 grams of citric acid. The other samples for comparison were made with 100 grams of pure dextrose, 70 grams of pure dextrose, 100 grams of my homemade invert syrup, and 100 grams of my homemade brown sugar invert syrup. So these results are really only about my particular technique for making invert syrup, but I will be testing other techniques as well as commercially available invert syrup. Obviously, this is not a super rigorous experiment, but the results are pretty striking. All of these different sorbet mixtures were churned for roughly the same time and then left in the freezer a full 24 hours at least. After all sitting in the same freezer, different pairs were taken out and their texture slash scoopability was compared, both directly out of the freezer and after sitting out at room temperature for a few minutes. as basically proof of principle. The sample with 100 grams of dextrose was compared to the sucrose sample. As you might expect, the dextrose sample was very noticeably softer than the sucrose sample, and it was also slightly softer than the sample that contained 70 grams of dextrose. Now for the really interesting results. The sample made with invert syrup was significantly harder than the sample made with 100 grams of dextrose. So that completely goes against a lot of information online and in my professional gelato book. What was even more surprising is that the invert syrup sample wasn't even equivalent to the 70-gram dextrose sample. Now I definitely need to run this experiment again, but the invert syrup from the professional book is definitely underperforming. And as a little side note, the brown sugar invert syrup was even worse than the regular invert syrup. Again, not rigorous. I will be testing honey, store-bought corn syrup, and a different technique of making invert syrup in the future, but I feel pretty comfortable making some preliminary conclusions. Clearly, 100 grams of this particular invert syrup recipe does not perform like 100 grams of dextrose in terms of anti-freezing power. It doesn't even perform like 70 grams of dextrose, which you would expect given the sugar syrup concentration, but I suspect this is due to the technique. But these results make me form a current working hypothesis. Even the best invert syrup is going to behave like its equivalent sugar concentration. So 100 grams of an 80% invert syrup is at most going to contribute the equivalent anti-freezing power of 80 grams of dextrose, which again goes against a lot of numbers online. But I think that is enough nerdiness for 1 week. Hopefully this experiment and video was somewhat interesting. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.